But before we get started, just a little bit about myself. I'm the CEO of Moesif, the leading API analytics and monetization platform. I love helping API first businesses with their PLG strategy, how to figure out usage-based pricing. And if you're ever in San Francisco, I love IPAs. You can hit me up. Here's my email address right here. But why are we talking about monetizing APIs today? Well, selling traditional SaaS is very different in 2023 and coming into 2024 than it was 10 years ago. What we used to see with SaaS was a lot of different manual tasks. A lot of the value was actually being delivered through the UI itself. And so typically that was actually rolled out to entire company or at least to an entire team or department. But today, a single developer can actually get started using an API, derive some new automation or some new use case, and it's usually very targeted. So one single developer can do a lot more today than what a team 10 years ago, where it took about 10 or 15 people to get up and running. And so what we've been seeing is the buying power has been shifted to individual developers themselves. So if you look at 2003 here, we had on-premise software. Typically, that was decided at the C-suite level or VP level. It was rolled out to the entire company or at least the entire department. And then this is where we go and see the authority of developers increasing over time as the cost of software has decreased. And so a single developer can actually get started with an API. Maybe it's only $50 a month or $100 a month. It's a very small amount, but they're able to increase and use those APIs within the organization. And so we're going to talk about all these different steps around defining a business strategy around your APIs, starting off with a pricing model, and then we'll talk about how to grow and expand your API business, how to measure different KPIs, and how do you actually figure out what's the next step, whether you iterate or you deprecate. Of course, there's also building and publishing the APIs themselves, but that's not the focus of this presentation. Instead, we're going to focus on this top half more around the business concerns. So let's just go ahead and dive into the business strategy. One thing to keep in mind is each API business is different. And so these are the different things you're going to have to think about as you're building out that API business. What do you actually charge for? Are you going to do prepaid billing or postpaid billing? How do you actually package the APIs and turn them into products and lay them out for an easy to understand way for people to purchase and pick? And when do you actually invoice customers? One key thing, though, is you want to always ensure whatever you're billing on is aligned to customer value. And so here we actually outlined a couple of different examples within the API industry. So the first one here, we've seen a lot within the telco space. Since, for example, is charging on transaction volume. So in terms of number of SMS being sent, number of voice minutes, some type of transaction volume that's included here. In the payments API space, we've always seen revenue or cost share. So Stripe famously will charge 2.9% of each transaction. This can also work for different expense reporting tools. We've seen this work well with, even things like Visa and that type of stuff. And we have things like data volume. So in the infrastructure space, Datadog charges on number of gigabytes in terms of log volume that's being ingested. And then we get to user-centric metrics, which we usually see within sales and marketing tools. A segment is a tool that charges on number of monthly unique users or monthly tracked users. And the last type of metric we've seen is resource metrics. So Amazon Redshift, where you're charging on number of compute hours or number of resources used. But notice for every single one of these metrics, I do not have requests per second or number of requests sent, because that is not necessarily aligned to customer value. An example that I like to bring up is, let's say you're building out an email API. There's two different ways you could actually charge. One would be to charge on the number of email templates stored in the platform. That seems like a pretty feasible option. And the other option could be to charge on number of emails being sent through the platform. Both seem initially viable options in terms of choosing a consumption metric. But if we think about the first one for a second, what happens if a customer signs up, they store 100 different templates in your platform, but they never ever send a single email? Well, that's not good, because then they were never able to reach a single customer. And most likely they want to sign up and start using your email platform to reach out to new customers, reach out to existing customers, somehow incorporate email outreach into their workflow. And so the other model where you're charging on number of emails being sent through the platform, or perhaps even number of different distinct emails, contact or or customers contact would be a much better metric, because that's exactly what the customer is looking for. So we're going to walk through a couple of different things to keep in mind as we look at these different billing strategies. So the first thing is prepaid versus postpaid billing. And anyone that's bought a phone in the last few years, you can go buy a burner phone at Walmart, and that's a prepaid billing concept, right? You buy $100 worth of minutes. You can use them in the course of a month or a couple months or whatever it is, right? Prepaid is very similar to traditional SaaS businesses, right? So it's much easier to understand how they work from a enterprise sales motion perspective. And it can also create a much better cash flow for your own business. So especially if this is a new product or new a startup even, and you're trying to bootstrap, with prepaid billing, you're able to actually have your customers commit upfront, and you can use that cash for investing into R&D. However, there's a big negative with prepaid billing, and that's the friction within onboarding itself, because you don't know what you don't know. And so if you're signing up to use an API and you start seeing all these different usage tiers, how do I know what usage I'm going to use for the month? Now I have to start doing all this mental gymnastics and math to try and figure out, is it going to be on this plan or this plan or this plan? It's going to be much harder when you're trying to reduce the friction within your onboarding process. And that's where we get into the postpaid billing, right? There, customers only need to pay for what they use, and it's already been consumed at that point. And so you can have a customer that signs up, and they don't even know what they're going to use, but a month later they get an invoice and they pay their bill, right? And we've seen this used quite a bit within the cloud industry. So you can sign up for AWS or Azure or other tools like that, and start spinning up some compute resources, and then 30 days later you're going to get a credit card statement and or a credit card charge. One of the biggest negatives, though, with postpaid billing is it can be abused. So we've seen this a lot within the AI space, where that the cost to serve that API traffic can be very expensive. There's a lot of compute that is underlying those APIs, and so that's where you have to be very careful, right? So what happens if someone signs up, uses $10,000 worth of your API, and then the credit card is no longer valid, and so it can be abused. The next thing we can look at is packaging strategy. And there's different ways to look at packaging, but the two common ways are tiered pricing and pay as you go. So tiered is what we typically see with the SaaS model, where you have a good, a better, and a best plan. It's much more predictable for your customers, right? So they can sign up for $100 a month, and they know exactly it's going to be $100 a month, and nothing more and nothing less, right? So they're buying that package. It's much easier to implement. You don't need a bunch of sophisticated metering and metrics tracking to figure out, what to actually charge the customer. They're buying basically a flat rate or fixed amount. But there could be a huge negative with these tiered pricing models, which is friction in expansion, right? And so if you think about a customer who purchases a plan, and let's say that plan's $100 a month, but they get $200 in value, right? So that means that the delta there is $100 difference, right? They're seeing $200 in value, but they're only paying $100. But let's say your next plan is $500 a month. Now they're still only getting $200 in value, and so they're not going to upgrade or switch to that next plan until they overcome that hump. And that could be a really tricky thing, especially when we want nice, smooth expansion revenue. And that's where this other model, which is pay as you go, can be much easier to drive expansion revenue, can be much more efficient for the customer, and it can appear cheaper, right? Because they only need to pay for what they need and nothing more. So it can be very nice for customers to start off small, and you can grow with your customers, and they're able to scale with you in both directions. But there is a big negative with pay-as-you-go models, which is you can have billing surprises, right? No one wants to sign up for API that costs maybe $50 a month, but then in a week later, they deploy this to production and they run through $10,000 worth of your API usage. And now they have to go explain that to their manager. Crap, I just spent $10,000 on this service I was just testing out, and it wasn't even generating revenue yet. So you have to be very careful to make sure the expansion ramp is at a very healthy pace and not too quick. And that's where things like customer success, support, sales can get engaged at the right point to make sure that customers are not going to be upset by these type of billing surprises. The last piece we're going to talk about around billing is when do you actually invoice the customers? Now, this is more of a accounting concern versus a product and engineering concern, but there are a couple of different ways you can manage this. So the typical model of recurring, where you invoice a customer each month, or maybe it's each quarter, each year, it's much more predictable for the customers. So especially when it comes to revenue recognition, gap accounting, on both sides, it's very easy to say exactly when the consumption happened for which month, which year. But it can have bad unit economics, especially if you have a low-cost SaaS. The example is, let's say you are building something like S3, right? You can actually sign up for Amazon S3 and use only a couple pennies for the month, and that's it. Are you going to send an invoice for 3 cents and handle that through a procurement cycle? That might actually even rub customers the wrong way. And so that's where we can actually look at things like threshold-based invoicing, where you only invoice the customer once a certain threshold is met. This could be both done on a prepaid system, where you're actually purchasing that threshold ahead of time. So you're purchasing, say, $500 worth of credits, or it can be done in a postpaid model. So once $500 worth of spend has been accumulated, you then go run the invoice. We see this a lot within the advertising industry. We talked a lot about the billing side. Let's now talk about how do you actually grow an API product. One thing to keep in mind is developers need buy-in from many different stakeholders. So it's not just up to them to actually go get up and running with an API. There's going to be a legal and security team. Is it actually compliant with the security policies at your company or at the customer's company? There's going to be competing different project priorities. A lot of different things that engineers are being pulled in different directions. And you have finance procurement, right? How do you make sure that you get the budget and sign off and everything? So all these other things are happening behind the scenes, even though an individual developer is looking to use your API. One way to actually sidestep all of these different points of friction is through self-service. And so instead of dealing with legal and security, have very simple click-through terms of service, so you can get up and running as quick as possible. Instead of dealing with a 6-month PLC process, have a very fast integration process. That integrates within their stack already, so maybe they can get up and running. Potentially, have something that's deployed in their environment. You can have a CloudFormation or Terraform template or something like that. Instead of dealing with a long procurement cycle, make it easier for them to put it on their manager's credit card. Now, this may not be the long game, but at least it gives developers an easy path to get up and running to test out your API. And your goal here is to land lots of developers as quick as possible and get them to a point of paying, even if it's just a token amount. Maybe it's just $5 a month. It doesn't have to be a lot. But what you're trying to do is get them to see value in your API so that then you can actually engage with them and drive the use cases and adoption. And then what you can do is then sell through these developers. And so what you usually see here is you have all these different developers on self-service, but you're not done, right? So there's going to be enterprise requirements that are going to come up around, maybe it's HIPAA compliance, maybe it's they need single sign-on for access to your portal. They're going to be expanding usage. They're going to deploy this out to production, and suddenly they are going to increase usage over time. And there's going to be also new use cases, right? They might have just started using a single API. Maybe it was just your SMS API, but you have 5 other APIs you could also be using. And so what we see here is a PLG sales flywheel, right? So the first 3 steps here, the orange parts, is the self-service part, and the black areas is a sales motion, right? And notice both are working together, right? So this is not a no sales motion, but it's more of a sales assisted motion. And so what we see here is a self-service developer will sign up. They get to their aha moment. They got up and running with the API. They see that it can solve their use case. Maybe they're using it through Insomnia or Postman or a tool like that. And then they start increasing their usage. As soon as they start increasing their usage, then sales will start engaging with those customers, especially if they're already within your ICP. They're exactly the type of customer you want to sell to. You see they already got up and running with the API, increasing the usage. Now, how do we actually identify ways to increase that usage further and new use cases? Maybe they just, again, are using one API, but there could be a lot of other APIs you could start using. And then as they get those other APIs integrated, they'll also accelerate and increase their usage. So you have this nice, beautiful flywheel that starts running when you have both a sales identifying the new use case and driving usage, and then the developer themselves also getting engaged. But scaling self-service is hard, right? You're going to have issues during onboarding. People are going to run into 4xx or 5xx errors. They're going to have changing business needs. They need to add users to the account. They need to change plans. They need to, manage that account. Or there's going to be the surprises I mentioned earlier. So how do you scale this when you have suddenly millions of different developers using your APIs? You definitely can't have account manager for every single one. One way to actually scale this is to make it as self-service as possible. So instead of requiring the developer to reach out and manage their plan and ask questions, give them the tools so they can see their usage directly within your portal. So they can see which APIs they're using, allows them to see how much value they're getting out of the API. They may not even know that they're using 10 different APIs in production. And you also want to avoid surprise by over communicating. So instead of waiting for a developer to get that $10,000 bill, keep nudging them, letting them know that you suddenly had a spike in usage this last week. Maybe it makes sense to set up a call with someone from your team, and so they can right size that plan, make sure they're on the right path to succeed. The last step here I want to talk about is measuring KPIs. We talked already about the billing strategy. We talked about growing the APIs. Now, how do we actually measure this? One thing to keep in mind is product owners should always be focused on one of these three business goals. There's adoption goals, there's engagement goals, and there's retention goals. Now, in any given quarter or even any given month, one of these may be a higher priority than the other. So, for example, when you first launch your API, adoption might be the priority. But then over time, as you start growing that developer base, engagement and retention might become more important. But let's walk. How do you actually track each of these different areas? So talk about adoption. One of the biggest things to focus on is reducing that time to hello world. Let's just define what is hello world. That's the time it takes to make that very first API call. It may be done through, again, a tool like Insomnia or Postman or Curl. It's not even a fully working app yet. At that point, they're just playing around with API to see if it solves a use case. And then once that's done, then we have this next step, which is first working app. That's when they have a fully deployed solution, whether that's for internal employees, external developers, customers. They actually see value being created through whatever it is that they built, right? And that could be in dollars and cents, it could be a growing user base. There's many different ways to measure that. But what we're trying to track here is both how long does it take to make that very first API call, which that is going to be impacted by your documentation, how easy it is to understand your API. But then the first working app might be dependent on things outside of the developer's control. Things, again, going back to that security review, procurement, and other pieces, because it can't deploy it until all of those things are done. So speaking on the next metric, which is engagement, these, again, should be measuring the customer value. So it should be actually almost aligned to what you're charging on. So, going back to that very initial screen that we talked about, if you're a telecommunications platform, you're charging on SMS sent through the platform, that's also what you should be measuring. Who's sending the most SMS? Are they sending it through a batch API? Are they sending a single API call? And notice here, again, we don't have requests per second, right? Because a customer doesn't care how many requests they're making against your API. What they care about is what they're getting out of it, right? In fact, you might offer a batch and a non-batch endpoint to send text messages through the platform. And for the customer, it actually makes more sense to use a batch endpoint. It's probably higher performant. It's easier to manage, but it's actually will translate into a lower number of requests per second because they're actually batching the requests. So again, trying to track exactly what they're getting out of the API so you can understand customer engagement. Lastly, but this is one of the most important metrics, is retention. How do you make sure that you don't have a leaky boat and customers are sticking with the platform and loyal, right? And there's a couple of different ways to measure retention. And what I'm showing here is weekly cohorts. So in week 0, of course, all developers are 100% because that's the week they signed up. But then we notice that each week thereafter, it drops off, right? So in week 1, we're actually tracking 2 different segments here. We have an enterprise segment, and so and a self-service segment. In the enterprise segment, it drops down to 75% for enterprise, and then it drops down to 38% for self-service customers. But notice how it flattens out, it levels out, right? So it never goes down to zero. And that's a healthy retention curve. Because by the time we get to week 8 or week 9, we still see enterprise around 81% and self-service around 31%. That's what I mean by flattening out, right? But if this goes all the way down to zero, that means you have a leaky boat. And you want to actually start figuring out, why are customers leaving so quickly? Are they not able to solve the use case? Is it a cost issue? Is it a documentation issue? Is it something else that they're missing? And so trying to dig into that before even investing into some of the adoption stuff is usually what I recommend. And lastly, notice that I'm not speaking on infrastructure metrics, because those are focused on engineering goals and not product goals. So things like uptime SOAs, resource utilization, errors, and so on. Now, you can incorporate some of these as you look at maybe customers who might run into errors. That is important from a CS standpoint, but that is not the way that a customer see an API. Lastly, how do you manage end of life? At a certain point, you have to figure out, do we actually keep iterating on this API and improving it, or do we actually finally deprecate it because, for whatever reason, we need to, move resources and invest in other areas? And the most important message and takeaway here is, don't break developer stuff. Make sure you handle deprecation gracefully. And there's many different ways to do that. You can do in-app notifications. You can send out emails, saying that you're using this API with this IP address or with this user agent. Just give them information so they know that they are using something that is going to go away soon. No one wants to wake up at 4 a.m. with some random alert because the API was shut down and they weren't aware of it. Lastly, if you have any question on how to monetize APIs, we focus on product analytics, usage-based billing, quota management, and guidance. You can find me here at Derric at Moesif.com or around the conference.